So our next speaker is Andre Freitas. I can see your slides up, but I don't know if your camera's on yet, Andre.
Yes, it is. I don't know if you can hear me well.
I can hear you well, yes. Yeah. So Andre is researcher at the IDEAP Research Institute, senior lecturer at the university, associate professor at the University of Manchester, AI group leader at the Digital Experimental Cancer Medicine team. So Andre is a senior lecturer at the Department of Computational Science at the University of Manchester, a research group leader at the IDEAP Research Institute, and an AI group leader at the Digital Experimental Cancer Medicine team. He leads the Reasoning and Explainable AI Lab. His main research interests are on enabling the development of representative paradigms at the neurosymbolic interface to support explainable inference for scientific reasoning. So today, Andre will discuss towards industrial scale scientific reasoning, encoding abstract neural language inference. So on that, I'll hand over to you, Andre.
Thanks, Mark. I think there is a problem with the camera, but I think you can see my slides well, right?
Yes, we can see your slides fine. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. Great pleasure to be here speaking to you all. So as Mark mentioned, I wear 3 hats, a senior lecturer at the Department of Computer Science in Manchester, a research group leader at IDEAP in Switzerland, and I'm also part of Cancer Research UK. This is the Explain Lab, so part of our research group that focuses on exactly the theme of reasoning and explainability. And we are going to talk about this theme in a very particular sense, and I think you're going to get very quickly the intuition in terms of what we mean by natural language inference and inference in general and explainability in this context. So the motivational scenario that we have is highly motivated by what we also observe with one of our hats related to cancer research, is somehow a collapse, a certain crisis in terms of the scientific inference process that we have in the context of personalized medicine, for example, right? So the difficulty of making strong, statistically valid claims for example, for very small cohorts of patients. So there is a certain tension between one possible way to do inference, which is the traditional way typically valued in medicine, which is based on statistics, frequentist statistics, versus on the other side, practices that in other sciences are more prevalent, with theory-based, right? And one of the things that I would like to propose here, maybe as a provocative thought, is that abduction, and we are going to define that as a type of natural language inference, could support us exactly addressing part of this crisis. So what I'm going to speak here not necessarily is going to communicate directly with drug discovery, but certainly can be applied in that context. But I'm explaining that in a broader context. So let's start by defining what we mean by inference. So typically, a typical, let's say, scientific pipeline contains some observations, some data collection, some analysis of this data using most likely some statistical methods, but commonly ends with a linguistic artifact, a set of conclusions that we use to communicate the main outcome of that, right? So that's our artifact in the context of this exemplar paper. And we have variations of other linguistic artifacts that captures and packages the conclusions of all of the scientific workflows, right? So we can package our observations and our conclusions in tables, right? With a mixture of quantitative and linguistic elements. And we can also package that depending on the scientific branch that we are on, equations, which are abstractions between how quantities relate. But the underlying theme here is that there is a connection between language, abstraction, and scientific practice. And in many cases, if not in all cases, all of our scientific endeavors end up in a linguistic output. Right, so then this leads us to the question, considering that this is available, the scientific output's available, what if we could infer over this major scientific statements at scale, right? What if we could just find the score statements, the score conclusions, link them, and that's the starting of the connecting theme with knowledge graphs, but maybe in a different sense, and then join them together, integrate that, and repurpose to answer new hypotheses and questions, right? So that's I think the motivation for this talk. And what I'm going to propose here is that one specific method that's now emerging for that we call abductive natural language inference can be a very central way to look into the perspective of integrating this set of disconnected scientific statements. So let's start defining abductive natural language inference. So essentially means inference to the best explanation. So using facts and evidence, and using for example, a problem that we call an explainable entailment here. So given that we have a certain scientific claim, that's a quite simple scientific claim, determine if this is true or false according to existing evidence, right? And we can assume that we have a certain database of facts that we consider to be trustworthy. That's the assumption behind that. And ideally, we would like to determine if that's true or false, and also derive an explanation based on existing knowledge. So that's the problem of abduction, one way to frame the problem of abduction. So the methods that I'm going to focus today is how to deliver this type of inference, right? So assuming a more realistic scenario. So most of the state of the art, if you think in natural language processing, under the perspective of natural language processing today, is more on the simpler type of scientific inference. But the areas that we are starting to work as a community is pointing in the direction of more complex inference that would be relevant, for example, in cancer research settings, in drug discovery settings. So again, the same problem, but in a more realistic way. So what we are looking ahead, and this is not currently fully functional, is given that we possibly have millions or even billions of facts, how do we assemble or reassemble these facts to explain a certain scientific claim? Right? So explanation here has the specific context, and explainability here has this specific abductive context. And behind the scenes, what we are talking about is how to build natural language processing, right? So machine learning based models in many cases, which deliver this type of inference. So, but actually, yeah, this is a kind of one example of one type of explanation that you would find, for example, in the medical domain. And you can see that this process, this argumentation tree that we can see, can get to a very complex state. So this hints on the complexity of the endeavor of trying to mimic what an expert oncologist, for example, would do. So just to be very, to state very clearly, I think the disruption opportunity that we'll see in the following years is to move from school level inference, which is more or less the state of the art in NLP today, if we think about abductive natural language inference, to more expert-driven types of inference, right? And this is something that we are working together as a community to deliver. So I'm going to emphasize, in the context of this talk, some unsolved challenges that we have in abductive natural language inference. And I'm organizing this into 6 strategic pillars. I'm going to go very briefly through them. Some of these topics may be a bit alien to some of you in terms of research area, but I think it's useful for you to get some technical points to where the state of the art lies at the moment. And of course, this is biased towards some of the work that we have been doing. So the first pillar that I would like to discuss and emphasize involves looking into one of the components of this inference chains, right? So looking at what we consider a node, right? So one can consider a knowledge graph as a triple, for example, where a node is an entity, but we can consider a node a scientific statement, right? So that's a possible unity of analysis that or representation that we can have. So assuming that we have a complex sentence, and in scientific discourse, sentences tend to be very complex, how do we represent this complex scientific discourse? And this is a single sentence. It will take a little bit of time even for a human to understand what's going on there. And one of the methodologies that we found quite robust, right, in terms of the quality of extractions and also the linguistic principles that are applied, is trying to do what we call the disembedding of the sentence, the clause and phrasal disembedding of the sentence. So given that we have a very complex sentence, how can we use some linguistic principles to essentially simplify the sentence into simpler statements, right? So this is one of the works that we have been developing together with colleagues at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, which consists essentially in trying to simplify, divide and conquer complex scientific statements. And we applied that to derive more traditional knowledge graphs. So on the top of these statements that you can see, for example, on the leaf nodes that we have in this tree, you can apply, for example, open information extraction and then derive triples out of that, right? But then you are done in a much more controlled semantic environment, right? And when we did that, what we found when we applying downstream relation extraction frameworks, what we found is that there is a significant improvement on the quality of that relation extraction. So for the people here who are very knowledge graph centered in the triple sense, and thinking about how to extract scientific statements, this could be a possible, very functional approach to derive robust knowledge graph extraction. So that's one pillar that we consider quite strategic. So I'm leaving some pointers here of an open source framework that one can experiment with, and an associated publication as well. So other types of statements that are very prevalent in scientific discourse are definitions, right? So really representing complex sentences. And if we think about representing natural language processing and representing semantics in scientific discourse, that's a really central aspect of the semantic treatment of scientific discourse, right? So given that we have, for example, a definition, how can we as well do a targeted semantic labeling to structure that definition into its feature components, right? Again, a kind of intentional level graph representation, but thinking more in terms of what we call in natural language processing semantic labeling, chunking a sentence and then assigning some roles to that, right? This is part of this complex sentence representation that one would require to understand scientific discourse. And again, we found this to be quite robust in terms of methodology, and that can operate over realistic, for example, discourse that you can find in papers. So considering that we can do this type of robust linguistic extractions, right? So we can now overlay some structure on the top of this flat natural language complex sentences. We can assume that now we can have a more expressive kind of linguistic model, right? Where we injected relational categorical biases within the model. And then we can think about now representing sentences and representing inferences in embedding spaces, right? So now looking to latent representations of these processes. So, and that would be the second pillar, right? So using these types of structural controls, and I'm talking about this embedding techniques that I mentioned, semantic labeling. So all the structure that we can extract, for example, and that are robust, that can be extracted at higher quality, to essentially derive more efficient inference and better controlled embedding spaces. And in this space, what we can observe is that we can split this area into kind of two major branches. One, the area of complex multi-hop inference, where the methodologies of using knowledge graphs to represent inferences tend to be prevalent. And also other areas of generative models. So how to build models that generate explanations. So in the context of multi-hop inferences, typically we are talking about retrieving facts, relevant facts, right? So from large knowledge base using embeddings as a methodology, while in generative models, we are talking about generating more freely this explanatory facts. So think about the argumentation graph that I showed in the beginning with all the premises. So one is retrieving from knowledge base, the other method is generating that out of an embedding space. So what we are looking at, essentially, visually speaking, is given that we have a multi-hop inference process where we have a set of premises and we have a conclusion, we want to build a model, right? And we are thinking here most typically in the neural sense or neurosymbolic sense that could emulate this inference, right? So given that we have this conclusion, determine that these premises are relevant, right? Or even generate these premises, or vice versa, given that we have these premises, what are the conclusions associated with that, right? And typically what the state of the art is going to emphasize today are latent types of embedding models. So the core message so far is that the combination of latent models, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the methodologies on the latent space soon, and some of the linguistic extraction that we can do on the top of this complex scientific discourse, they can dialogue very well, right? So that essentially one can generalize faster because as you can imagine, there is a lack of annotated data to infer this type of stepwise inference, right? So it's very expensive type of annotated knowledge. So when we think about an explanatory chain and thinking here just on another area, we can see when we start looking at the explanations, we see that explanations, they organize with certain patterns of inference, right? We can look as a corpus and start determining some common patterns of inference. So I'm just talking about the most obvious one, which is most commonly we have in an explanation elements which are just providing the abstraction of the explanatory part. So this consists of definitions, rephrasings, and then we have something that we call the unification element, the core scientific statement that helps to unify that. So given that we have a claim, typically we have some facts that work as a kind of definitional glue, right? And a set of facts that are the hardcore scientific facts. And this is quite a universal pattern of explanation that you can observe when you start organizing and looking into the linguistics and the discourse linguistics that one observes in scientific explanation. So you can use these patterns to develop models as well that generalize faster and that essentially emulates the reason that a scientist would do while reading a text, right? So I'm not going through too many details, just leaving to some pointers that we have. So we developed some models that are exactly exploring this type of explanatory patterns, right? And encoding these explanatory patterns within neural architectures. So I'm not going to go too much into the technical details on how we are going to do that, but leaving here as some pointers that this combination of determining these universal patterns of explanation, scientific explanation, and then using this linguistic and inference knowledge to encode that into neurosymbolic architectures, there is something powerful there in terms of architectures that needs to generalize fast, right? And this, we can observe that the quality of inference that we get within this type of encoding these explanatory patterns tend to be quite robust and consistent, right? Especially in the context of what we call multi-hop explanation. So when we need to join multiple facts together to deliver a explanation. So in terms of the architectures that we see emerging for that, as I mentioned to you, graph neural networks, similar to what was discussed before, is a very common architecture for this type of encoding multi-hop inference. The problem is that in the case of scientific inference, typically we have more scarce annotations. And typically the inference process involves quite hard abstractions, right? So architectures that typically evolve or are good in a retrieval context are not so performant in the context of scientific, more abstract multi-hop inference. So one of the architecture that we are experimenting with is via linear programming and variations of that using deep learning and essentially combining deep learning with linear programming and trying to encode explanatory patterns using linear programming paradigm, right? And then essentially trying to inject this type of constraints into the multi-hop inference process so that we can have this type of, for example, abstraction unification type of encoding, or that we can explicitly encode values of relevance, cohesion between explanatory facts, and diversity, so that we can have better control. So if I would tell a keyword when we are talking about a neurosymbolic inference, especially over scientific abstractions, is semantic control. So developing architectures which allow for experts to encode semantic patterns, inference patterns. Again, just leaving some pointers in terms of what is the state of the art, or some of the state of the art in this area. So this is one of the architectures of one of our most recent work. So the diff explainer, so which essentially encodes this multi-hop abstraction over what we call sentence embeddings. So some of you in natural language may have already experimented with sentence BERT and this type of transformer-based representations. So how do you encode explanatory constraints over knowledge bases of sentence embeddings, right? And how do you do that at scale? So that's the type of problem that we are looking at. So again, it's always this balance between semantic control, adding structure, adding prior knowledge of inference, prior linguistic knowledge, and leveraging the flexibility of contemporary embeddings. Again, these approaches show to be very robust in terms of coping with more complex explanatory patterns, and as well to be way more parsimonious in terms of the size of the parameter space that they are using. Right? So because you're leveraging this explanatory patterns and you're encoding that as priors in the knowledge. So another line of work that we are not going to cover here, but I'm just going to mention because I think it's quite strategic, is the use of what we call disentanglement and generative models to generate the explanations, right? So instead of just retrieving explanations, one can think about encoding the explanations in a generative way. And in this case, the semantic control is given by trying to get what are the disentangled factors that you have in the latent space. So really trying to use the structure that typically you observe in the sentence, right? So you can imagine this type of predicate argument structure, or you can think about semantic roles, to use that as prior knowledge and try to make that explicitly disentangled in latent spaces, right? So all of this are about this balance between the neuro and symbolic, and what we observe is that there are emerging quasi-symbolic inference properties that one would have with this type of space. So meaning that one can have better control, better semantic control of these spaces. Another area that when we are talking about scientific inference that we also have some work as well that we consider to be quite new, it's a quite new area and less important in the context of drug discovery, is how to use and integrate into the same embedding spaces equational inference, right? So equations are statements about quantitative relations. So there are now existing models that use similar principles to what I discussed before to encode mathematical abstract inference, so multi-hop inference over mathematical proofs. So again, given that you have a set of mathematical statements that you can mine and extract from papers, how do you put that together to deliver a new proof in mathematics? And again, the same theme, if we are talking about the bigger context of scientific inference, consists of integrating as well tabular inference. So there is very recent work, I think in the past 2 years, there is a strong traction on thinking on how to embed facts that you can observe from tables, right? Embedding full tables or rows and columns from tables, and then allow for natural language inference, right? So imagine that you have a certain clinical trial cohort, set of patient characteristics, and then making a statement determining if that's true or false according to what is expressed in the table. So there is a lot of recent work in table factual entailment, textual entailment. So that's a quite hot area in the context of natural language processing. So I know that a lot of people here maybe are listening these areas for the first time, but I think it's useful to know that there is now some very exciting work on this area. And I'm trying here to provide a kind of big picture that if one would see maybe some years from now, the integration of tabular inference, equational inference, and inference over complex sentences, multi-hop inference, is pointing in the direction of this possibility of doing large-scale inference over scientific text. So that's a quite exciting area. So maybe one of the last areas that I would like just also to mention is on the granular evaluation of these embeddings. So much of these approaches tend to be evaluated in terms of F1 scores. So really their results without paying too much attention to how these models are representing the inference and the semantics. And there is also a quite recent trend in trying to evaluate these models using one methodology that we call natural language processing, syntactic and semantic probing, right? So essentially it's trying to understand what these models are doing, trying to make the inference a little bit more transparent, and trying to understand better qualitatively what's happening behind the scenes, right? So again, leaving another keyword that I consider, and our group has contributed to some works on this area, to be strategic to deliver this end-to-end, more granular abstract inference. So with all of that, I think the intent is that we have tools that allow faster generalization to produce models which can be then annotated by domain experts. And here we have some of our collaborators, which are oncologists, and then they are helping us to build this knowledge bases, this inference, what we call explanation banks and fact banks. But then we are being very parsimonious actually on the way that we are asking the annotation, because these models tend to generalize slightly faster if you're just applying, for example, a simple vanilla transformer-based model. So thinking about the big picture, I think the way that we see is that if we combine this, the extraction of robust controls, right, and then integrate that as explicit semantics into latent spaces, right, and then integrate quantitative aspects, understand what's going on from the point of view of the neurosymbolic representation, and then start parsimoniously annotating and engaging with domain experts. I think this allows for a virtual inference engine factor, virtual cycle that allows the efficient annotation of complex inference, because that's the challenge that we have, right? So how can we have examples of complex inference, but how can we annotate exactly the examples that are not addressed by the existing model? So essentially that's how we see some of this community unfolding in the next few years in order to cover this gap of expert scientist inference. So just to summarize, I think the message here is that there is an exciting area emerging in natural language processing of expert level, scientific inference and explanation. So I think the key words to deliver that is granular, controlled, neurosymbolic inference. So very exciting if you are into applied machine learning, very, very challenging area. And another challenge is how to deliver that over real and large-scale scientific discourse, right? So I think the vision is, given that we have very large knowledge base of facts extracted from papers, tables, how can we use these facts and tables to hypothesize new scientific questions and new scientific claims, right? So, and then the idea here is to exploit the structure of scientific explanations for multi-hop inference design. So we're looking at really injecting inference controls into these models, encoding strategies for complex and abstract sentences, and I touched some particular aspects on how to represent definitions, how to represent very long sentences, how to divide and conquer complexity there. And also using, for example, techniques or concepts, right, in machine learning to get more control over latent spaces, to deliver this quasi-symbolic inference that is somehow one of the targets of integrating the world of symbolic inference with the world of neural inference. And then doing the granular evaluation, so not only relying on F1 scores, but also using methodologies, emerging methodologies such as probing and metamorphic testing to understand what is going on this latent space. And then putting together into complex inference solvers, right? So I think what we see is that prior knowledge is very important to deliver efficient generalization under very complex inference scenarios. So how to do that in a declarative way. That's all from my side. Thank you for your attention. I'm very looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Andre. Very interesting talk there.